The quiet, well-manicured streets of a gated community near San Diego were shattered by a shocking crime. A man, a father and military reservist, was shot to death inside his own home. The gruesome murder would set in motion one of the most bizarre police interrogations ever recorded. The chilling part was not just the brutality of the crime, but the cold, calculating nature of the person who committed it. As detectives would soon discover, the killer wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random break-in or a robbery gone wrong. The perpetrator was someone very close to the victim, living under the same roof. The motive behind the murder was even more unbelievable and senseless, a culmination of minor family conflicts that spiraled into a cold-blooded act of violence. The killer's actions after the murder were equally unsettling, as they calmly went about their day, as if nothing had happened, enjoying a birthday celebration while the victim lay dead in his home. This story would tear a family apart and leave behind a trail of grief and unanswered questions, all stemming from a moment of uncontrolled rage and a complete lack of remorse. It was a tragedy that proved sometimes the greatest dangers lie right within our own four walls. The victim's name was Jard Dakio. He was a respected military reservist, a successful real estate agent, and a dedicated coach for a kids' rugby team. By all accounts, he was a loving family man and a deeply generous person, a guiding light to his younger brother, George. Jard was a man people loved to be around, and he had built a life for himself in an upscale neighborhood in Fallbrook, California. He lived there with his wife, Laura, their two young children, and his older son from a previous relationship. The house was a hub of activity, and to an outsider, it might have seemed like a picture of domestic bliss. However, a closer look revealed a family dynamic that was anything but harmonious. Living in the guest house on the property was Laura's mother, Cynthia Cedabaka. Cynthia had recently suffered a stroke, and Jard, out of a sense of duty and compassion, had welcomed her into their home to ensure she received the care she needed. It was an act of kindness intended to keep the family together, but it would ultimately lead to a deep-seated tension that would fester and eventually boil over. The house, which had been a place of warmth and love, had become a powder keg of resentment and animosity. With 3 generations living under one roof, the household was far from the perfect harmonious family life of a TV sitcom. The living arrangement was strained, particularly between Jard and his mother-in-law, Cynthia. Their relationship was tense, and they often simply coexisted, navigating around each other with a palpable sense of unease. The guest house, meant to bring them closer, only seemed to highlight their differences and create more friction. Their constant conflicts were a source of stress for the entire family, but especially for Laura, who found herself caught in the middle. One of the main points of contention was Cynthia's smoking habit. Jard, a staunch protector of his children's health, absolutely detested it. He had a rule: no smoking in the presence of his kids. He believed that if you were going to live in his home, you had to abide by his rules. He saw it as a matter of respect and safety, but Cynthia saw it as an infringement on her personal freedom. This rule, meant to keep the peace, became the first of many battlegrounds between the two, laying the foundation for a much deeper resentment. The stage was set for a series of small clashes that would build up over time, eventually leading to a shocking and tragic conclusion. The animosity between Jard and his mother-in-law, Cynthia, was well known within the family. One of the glaring issues was Cynthia's smoking. She was only allowed to smoke outside, on the back patio, a rule that Jard enforced with a peculiar and humiliating method. A family member recalled an incident where Cynthia was on the patio smoking a cigarette, and Jard, who was watering the lawn, would see the smoke and say, "Where I see smoke, I see fire. Gotta put out the fire." He would then turn the garden hose on her, soaking her with water. It was a bizarre, childish act of control that deeply upset Cynthia. This wasn't an isolated incident either. The same family member stated that Jard also used this method on his wife, Laura, if she said something he didn't like. The garden hose became a symbol of his authority and control, and to Cynthia, it was a profound act of disrespect and abuse. She felt humiliated and powerless in her own daughter's home, and the resentment grew with each splash of water. The conflict between Jard and Cynthia was not limited to the issue of smoking. Another recurring argument revolved around the way Jard disciplined the children. Cynthia believed that Jard was too strict with his kids, often voicing her disapproval of his methods. She felt his discipline was overly harsh, and she would frequently try to intervene or undermine his authority. On the other hand, Jard also disapproved of the way Cynthia would discipline the children. He felt she was too lenient and that her influence was spoiling them. This constant disagreement over the children's upbringing put a tremendous strain on the household. Jard's wife, Laura, was often caught in the middle, torn between her husband and her mother. It was a classic family struggle where different parenting styles and a clash of values created a breeding ground for bitterness and anger. The tension in the house was a constant, low-level hum, and everyone was walking on eggshells. What might have seemed like typical family problems to some was a deeply serious and painful reality for the people living in that house. Laura was in an impossible position. She loved both her husband and her mother, but their constant fighting was tearing her apart. She was the unwilling mediator in a war that had no end in sight. The emotional toll of being constantly caught between the two people she loved most was immense. But today was supposed to be different. Today, the family was meant to put aside their differences to celebrate two important events. It was Jard's daughter's spelling bee, a significant milestone for the family. And even more importantly, it was Cynthia's 63rd birthday. A photo from the previous year's birthday showed a smiling Cynthia with a sign that read, "Happy birthday, Granny." The family was trying to make a fresh start and create happy memories together, but the bitterness and resentment between Jard and Cynthia were like a dark cloud hanging over the house. The day was supposed to be a joyous occasion, filled with family and love, but it was not meant to be. The quiet of the morning would soon be broken by the piercing sounds of gunfire, and the celebrations would be cut tragically short. The day that was meant to be a new beginning would become the day of a terrible ending. Before the day of the spelling bee and Cynthia's birthday turned into a tragedy, there were plans for celebration. Cynthia's niece, a close family member, had a special day mapped out for her. "I had planned on going over there and taking her to lunch and pampering her that day and just spending the day with her," she recalled. It was meant to be a day of happiness and togetherness, a chance to spoil Cynthia on her special day and celebrate her life. But the day would never be what anyone had planned. A sudden, jarring sound pierced the air and changed everything. The sound was gunfire, and it echoed through the peaceful, gated community. Neighbors, alarmed and concerned, immediately called 911. The noise was terrifying, and the screams that followed were even more so. The piercing sounds of gunshots and the desperate cries for help changed the course of the day from one of celebration to one of horror and tragedy. The day that was meant to be a tribute to Cynthia's life would instead become the day of Jard's death. The sound of gunfire changed everything, and in an instant, a day of happiness was turned into a day of sorrow and loss. The tranquility of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of gunshots. Concerned neighbors immediately began calling 911, their voices filled with fear and urgency. The first caller, a woman, said she was sitting in her house and heard 4 or 5 discharges. She was not a gun expert, but she knew the sound was not normal. She was terrified. A second caller, a woman who was in her bathroom doing her hair, heard the gunshots and opened her window. She heard what sounded like a man screaming, "Help me! Help me!" She was scared and confused, and she heard another shot. A third caller reported 5 gunshots fired behind his house and heard someone yelling, "Help me!" He said he heard another shot, then another, then 3 more. The neighborhood was in a state of chaos, and the dispatcher was trying to get all the information she could. The neighbors were reporting a man screaming for help, and the dispatcher was trying to determine if it was a man or a woman. The situation was tense, and the dispatcher knew she had to get deputies on the scene as quickly as possible. The calls painted a picture of a brutal and terrifying crime in progress.
The 911 dispatcher listened intently as the callers described the chaotic scene. They all heard multiple gunshots and the frantic cries of a person in distress. One caller was particularly disturbed, reporting hearing someone screaming, "Help! Yeah!" The dispatcher asked if the person was male or female, and the caller replied that it sounded like a man but could also be an old female with a raspy smoke voice. The description was vague and didn't provide a clear picture of what was happening. However, the dispatcher knew that time was of the essence. Several deputies were already on their way to the quiet enclave, their sirens blaring in the distance.
The police were heading to a scene of a violent crime, and they didn't know what they were going to find. The dispatcher was trying to get as much information as possible to prepare the deputies for what they might encounter. The situation was tense and unpredictable, and the dispatcher knew she had to stay calm and focused. The entire neighborhood was in a state of fear and confusion, and the police were the only ones who could bring some order back to the chaos. As deputies arrived on the scene, they were met with a horrific sight. The quiet, suburban neighborhood was now a crime scene. A trail of blood led them to the victim's house, and the officers knew they had to act quickly. They cautiously approached the home and looked through the windows. From the outside, they could see the victim's body. He was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. The officers immediately went in to conduct a rescue, but it was too late. The man was dead. The victim was Jard Dakio. He had been shot multiple times, and there was no doubt he was the victim of a brutal and savage crime. The police secured the scene and began their investigation, but they knew this was not going to be an easy case. They had a crime scene, a victim, and a neighborhood full of terrified witnesses, but they had no idea who had committed the crime. The scene was a chaotic mess, and the police were trying to piece together the events that led to Jard's death. The quiet neighborhood had been turned into a scene of unimaginable violence, and the police knew they had to find the killer before they could hurt anyone else. Jard's brother, George, was at work when he received the call about an emergency at his brother's house. He immediately rushed over, not knowing what to expect. As he approached the neighborhood, he could hear the ominous sounds of helicopters circling overhead. It was a sound he would never forget. The entire street was blocked off with yellow police tape, and he could see a sea of police cars and officers everywhere. The sight of the police presence sent a jolt of fear through him. He knew right then and there that something terrible had happened. He was in a state of shock and disbelief, and he couldn't believe this was happening to his family. He was trying to get through the police tape, but he was told to stay back. He was confused and scared, and he didn't know what was going on. He was trying to get any information he could, but the police were tight-lipped. He was just standing there watching the scene unfold, and he was filled with a sense of dread. He knew his brother was in trouble, and he was powerless to do anything about it. After what seemed like an eternity, George finally got the devastating news. After many long hours of waiting and wondering, he learned that the body found in the pool of blood was his brother Jard. He had been shot multiple times and was dead. George was in complete shock. He couldn't believe it. He said, "Wow, wow, wow." The news was so shocking and so terrible that his mind just couldn't process it. He was filled with a sense of disbelief and grief, and he couldn't understand how this could have happened. He just kept repeating the word "wow" over and over again. He was trying to come to terms with the fact that his brother, his role model, his guiding light, was gone. He was in a state of deep sorrow and despair, and he couldn't believe that he would never see his brother again. The news was a gut punch, and he was struggling to deal with the overwhelming emotions. The family was in shock and mourning, and they all wanted to know who had done this to Jard. The entire family was in a state of disarray, and they were all trying to cope with the terrible news. George had the heartbreaking task of calling his family on the East Coast to deliver the dreadful news. He called his mother, who was so shocked that she lost her breath, but after a moment, she said something that would haunt George for the rest of his life. She said, "That woman, Laura's mother, killed my son." It was an unbelievable accusation, and George didn't believe it. He didn't think Cynthia could be capable of such a brutal act.
However, he had his own suspicions. His brother had an 18-year-old son who was a recovering drug addict, and he was always looking for money. Jard was a disciplinarian and was strict with his son, so George thought that maybe the son had retaliated against his father. He thought it was a more plausible theory than Cynthia, the frail, older woman. He thought it could be a drug deal gone wrong or a fight over money. He didn't want to believe that someone in the family would do something like this, but he knew it was a possibility.
The family was in a state of chaos, and they were all trying to make sense of the senseless crime. The police were trying to make sense of the crime scene. They had a victim, Jard, and they had a motive, but they had no idea who had committed the crime. They were looking for any and all suspects, but their main focus was on Jard's mother-in-law, Cynthia. They knew she lived in the guest house on the property, and that she and Jard had a strained relationship. The police were trying to find her, to question her, but they couldn't locate her. George, on the other hand, was worried about his aunt. He was concerned that she might have been hurt during the crime. He couldn't imagine that she would be the killer. He was just hoping that she was safe and that she was not a victim of the crime. The police, however, had a different perspective. They knew that Cynthia had a motive, and they wanted to hear her side of the story. They were not ruling anyone out, including Jard's eldest son, but Cynthia was their main suspect. The entire family was in a state of chaos, and they were all trying to find Cynthia. They didn't know that she was about to make a confession that would shock them all. Hours after the murder, detectives finally found Cynthia. She was not hiding or in a state of panic. Instead, she was celebrating her 63rd birthday at her favorite coffee shop. She was in a jovial mood, happily greeting the police officers as they approached her. She seemed completely unaware of the tragedy that had occurred at her home. She was friendly and talkative, almost as if she was expecting them. She asked, "Hi, what's going on? What brings me here?" The police were stunned by her cheerful demeanor. They took her to the station for questioning, but they knew this was not going to be a normal interrogation. She was so happy and carefree that they couldn't believe she was involved in the murder. They were trying to piece together the events that led to Jard's death, and they knew that Cynthia was the key to solving the case. The police were about to learn exactly what brought her to the station, and they were about to hear a confession that would shock them all. The detectives began the interrogation by gently breaking the news to Cynthia. They told her that something terrible had happened at her house, and that Laura's husband had passed away. Cynthia's reaction was nonchalant. She didn't seem to be surprised or saddened by the news. She just stared at the detectives, seemingly unfazed by the devastating information. When they repeated that Laura's husband had been killed today, she just said, "Huh?" and looked away. Her complete lack of emotion was unsettling. The detectives were trying to gauge her reaction, but she wasn't giving them anything. She was just sitting there, calm and collected, as if she was talking about the weather. Her demeanor was so strange that the detectives knew they had to tread carefully. They were trying to get her to open up and tell them what she knew, but she was being difficult. She was not cooperating, and she was not showing any emotion. The detectives knew that this was going to be a long and difficult interrogation, but they were determined to get to the bottom of the case. As the detectives continued to question Cynthia, her pleasant demeanor quickly turned to contempt. They asked her what she thought of Jard, and she gave a big thumbs down. She then went on to say that she didn't like him, and that he was a very mean person. She claimed that he had been abusive to her, her daughter, and her grandkids for years. She said he had sprayed her with water, tripped her, and even choked Laura. She said he was mean to me and all of them. He's mean to everybody. Her words were filled with anger and resentment, and it was clear that she was not a fan of Jard. She saw him as a monster who was terrorizing her family, and she believed that he deserved what he got. The detectives were trying to get a clear picture of their relationship, and Cynthia was painting a very dark picture. She was not holding back,
and she was telling them all the horrible things that Jard had done. The detectives were listening intently, and they were trying to piece together the motive for the crime. The interrogation took a shocking and chilling turn when Cynthia suddenly confessed to the murder. The detectives were asking her if anyone had tried to stop Jard, and she said, "Can't stop him." She then said, "It sounds like somebody had to stop him. Or I did. Okay, I did. Okay. I was guilty. Somebody had to stop him. I did. Okay. It's okay."
They couldn't believe what they were hearing. She had just confessed to a brutal murder, and she was doing it with such a calm and collected demeanor. The detectives were trying to keep their composure, but they were in a state of shock. She then asked if he was dead, and she said, "You tell me. Gotta be dead. I hope so." Her words were filled with a sense of hope and relief, and it was clear that she wanted him dead. The detectives knew they had their killer, and they were about to get a full confession. Cynthia had just sealed her fate, and there was no turning back. The detectives asked Cynthia what had set her off that morning. She told them that the final straw was a comment Jard had made before his daughter's spelling bee. He had told Cynthia that she couldn't go to the spelling bee dressed like that because it looks like you're ghetto. The comment deeply offended Cynthia. She took it as a profound insult to her character and her way of life. The detectives were trying to understand how a simple comment could lead to such a violent act, but Cynthia was very clear. She was not going to let him get away with it. After he made the comment, she went to her guest house, got her revolver from her purse, and went back to the main house. She was not thinking clearly, and she was filled with rage. The detectives were trying to get a clear picture of the events, and Cynthia was giving them a full account. She was not holding back, and she was telling them everything. She was revealing the horrifying truth behind the murder, and it was all over a simple comment. Cynthia confirmed to the detectives that she had fired a total of 15 rounds at Jard. Of those 15 shots, 12 had hit her son-in-law, killing him. The detectives then asked her a truly heartbreaking question. "Did he say anything to you?" Cynthia's answer was chilling and unbelievable. She said that as he lay dying, he had said, "Grandma, I love you." The detectives were in a state of shock. They couldn't believe that a man who had just been shot multiple times by his mother-in-law would say such a thing. It was a testament to his love for his family, even in his final moments. But Cynthia was unmoved. She just stared at the detectives with a blank expression on her face. She was not showing any emotion, and she was not showing any remorse. The detectives were trying to understand her, but she was a complete mystery. She was a woman who had just confessed to a brutal murder, and she was not showing any signs of regret. She was a complete mystery, and the detectives were trying to piece together the puzzle of her mind. Cynthia's lack of remorse was a key point of the interrogation.
When asked if she checked to see if Jard was dead, she calmly replied, "I didn't care." She then went on to describe her actions after the murder. She didn't call the police or an ambulance. Instead, she went and enjoyed her birthday. She went to Denny's, a popular diner, to have a meal. Then she went to a casino where she gambled for 2 hours. Finally, she went to her favorite coffee shop where she was found by the detectives. It was as if she was trying to have a normal day, as if nothing had happened. She was completely unfazed by the fact that she had just murdered her son-in-law. The detectives were stunned by her cold-blooded actions. She was a woman who had just confessed to a brutal murder, and she was not showing any signs of regret. She was a complete mystery, and the detectives were trying to piece together the puzzle of her mind. The detectives were trying to process Cynthia's chilling confession when she asked them a question that would haunt them forever. She asked, "Is he alive?" When they told her that he was not, she let out a celebratory cry. "Oh, good, 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 good! Oh, thank you!" Her words were filled with a sense of joy and relief, and it was clear that she was happy he was dead. The detectives were not the only ones who heard her heartless admission. Jard's family was sitting in a waiting room at the sheriff's station, and they heard everything through the thin walls. George, Jard's brother, and the other family members were in a state of shock. They couldn't believe that Cynthia was capable of such a brutal act, and they couldn't believe she was celebrating his death. The family was in a state of complete disbelief and despair, and they were struggling to come to terms with the terrible news. The entire family was in a state of disarray, and they were all trying to cope with the terrible news. The interrogation continued, and the detectives pressed Cynthia on her feelings. "You don't feel bad about it?" they asked. "No," she replied without hesitation. "Would you do it again?" they asked. "Yes," she said. Her answers were chilling, and her complete lack of remorse was unsettling. With this exceptionally enthusiastic admission of guilt, the detectives allowed family members to come in and say their goodbyes. Jard's wife, Laura, Cynthia's daughter, was inconsolable. She was devastated by the loss of her husband and the knowledge that her own mother was the killer. "Oh God, oh my God, birthday, no, 13 years, I want to go get him," she cried. The detectives were trying to console her, but they knew there was nothing they could do. The family was in a state of complete disarray, and they were all trying to cope with the terrible news. Jared's young daughter, Cynthia's granddaughter, was also allowed to see her. The little girl was brought into the room, but she was horrified by the sight of her grandmother. She refused to go near her and screamed, "No, you killed my dad!" The words were a gut punch to everyone in the room. A child was forced to face a terrible truth that no child should ever have to face. The family was in a state of complete disarray, and they were all trying to cope with the terrible news. Before placing Cynthia Cedabaka under arrest and taking her to jail, the detective suggested one last thing. He asked her to call on a higher power and to pray. Cynthia scoffed at the idea, saying she didn't pray to anyone. But the detective insisted, saying she should pray for the first time ever. Cynthia, with a defiant grin, said, "Hope he dies." Her words were a final act of cruelty and a final nail in her coffin. The detectives knew they had a cold-blooded killer on their hands, and they were about to send her to jail. Cynthia's behavior at the end of the interrogation left no doubt in the minds of the detectives. She was a cold, callous, and premeditated killer.
The detectives revealed that she had been planning the murder for some time. She'd even been to a shooting range 2 weeks earlier to practice with the very same gun she used to kill Jard. This was not a crime of passion. It was a planned execution. Doctors evaluated Cynthia, and they found her competent to stand trial. Almost 3 years after Jard was gunned down, the trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor revealed that Cynthia would refer to herself as Ghetto Grandma, and that she would tell her grandkids how she did it. She wasn't remorseful, she was proud. The prosecution was trying to paint a picture of a cold-blooded killer who was not remorseful for her actions. The trial would be long and difficult, and the family was struggling to deal with the terrible news. The trial was a difficult time for the family. Laura, Jard's wife and Cynthia's daughter, was put in an impossible position. She had to choose between her husband and her mother. In a shocking turn of events, she testified for the defense in order to support claims that Jard was abusive. The defense was trying to paint a picture of a man who was a monster, a man who deserved what he got. The prosecution, however, had the interrogation video. They had Cynthia's confession, a confession that showed no remorse, and a confession that was filled with joy and relief. The video was a powerful piece of evidence, and the prosecution was using it to their advantage. They were trying to show the jury that Cynthia was a cold-blooded killer who was not remorseful for her actions. The trial was long and difficult, and the family was struggling to deal with the terrible news. The jury would have to decide whether Cynthia was a killer or a victim. The case went to the jury after many days and many witnesses. When everyone returned to the courtroom to hear the verdict, Cynthia was seen waving strangely to the judge, a final, bizarre act of defiance. But it was no use. Cynthia Cedabaka was found guilty of murder in the first degree. The jury had seen the evidence, they had heard the confession, and they had made their decision. She showed no remorse, none whatsoever. She was a cold-blooded killer, and she was going to pay for her crime. At Cynthia's sentencing, Jard's sister, Janisa, held up 15 photos for the 15 shots fired. She told the court that every one of the photos epitomized Jard, his family, and his love of life. It was a heartbreaking tribute to a man who was taken too soon. Laura also addressed the court, expressing her love for both her mom and Jard. The guilty killer grandma was going down hard, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The judge sentenced 66-year-old Cynthia Cedabaka to 50 years to life in prison. George, Jard's brother, felt that she got off easy, that she deserved to be in prison for the rest of her life. The one question that remained was there abuse? The police looked into the claims of abuse, but they determined that whether or not they were true, Cynthia had no right to make herself the judge, jury, and executioner. This was simply an act of vigilante homicide. The family was now suffering the loss of two of their own, one at the hands of the other. George said, "I still cry a lot. Not only did we lose Jard that day, but we lost my aunt too." He called her a devil and a monster, and he couldn't understand how she could do something like that to someone who let her live in his home. The family was left to mourn the loss of Jard and to deal with the fact that his killer was his own mother-in-law. The story was a tragic reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers lie right within our own four walls.